This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast.
Eventually, I was wondering, how could I write a story about this? And eventually, I realized it couldn't be nonfiction, it had to be fiction. So, Carrying Albert Home, the somewhat true story of a man, his wife, and her alligator, has been a very successful book. It's been really big in book clubs. I love it.
You're listening to the one and only Homer Hickam talking about one of the 19 books of nonfiction and fiction he's written. You might be familiar with his work, particularly his memoir series that began with Rocket Boys, or the movie October Sky that was made from that memoir, in which Jake Gyllenhaal played a young Homer growing up in a West Virginia coal camp with dreams of working in the space program. Well, I invited Mr. Hickam to Wise County, Virginia, and we were so lucky that he had time in his busy schedule to make a stop here. Homer spent the day on our campus. He had lunch with our students and then spoke to a packed auditorium that night. He'd agreed to do the podcast before coming, and I thought it would be a great idea to do the same thing I'd done with Barbara Kingsolver and Jeff Biggers and get students involved in that discussion. It creates a different kind of energy for writers when they're able to engage with people and their questions face to face. So I recorded this episode in a small group setting that included UVA-wise students from my podcasting class, students in Appalachian Studies, and creative writing students. Let me tell you a little bit more about Homer in case you're not familiar with his background or the incredible range of his work. Homer Hickam grew up in the coal mining town of Coalwood, West Virginia, where the horizon was dotted with tipples and lined with trains rather than telescopes. But as a teenager, inspired by the dawn of the space age, with 1957 launch of Sputnik 1, he and his fellow rocket boys began building and launching rockets. With encouragement from his teacher, Miss Riley, that passion for learning, experimenting, and daring to dream became the foundation for his memoir, Rocket Boys, which later was adapted into the film October Sky. After high school, Hickam went on to Virginia Tech, which is one of my alma maters, where he joined the Corps of Cadets, and he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in industrial engineering. He served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War, where he earned commendations for his leadership and bravery. He later joined NASA, contributing to projects that helped train astronauts and support missions like the repair of the Hubble Space Telescope and manager of training for the International Space Station. He was even able to see a model of Sputnik 1 while he was training astronauts in Russia and met the men who launched it. He has been, get this, a coal miner. He mined coal. His father was a foreman in a coal mining camp, so that was what he did to put himself through college when he was at Virginia Tech. He did that in the summertime. A scuba instructor and an avid amateur paleontologist. Along the way, he became a best-selling author of 19 works of fiction and nonfiction, telling stories rooted in resilience and imagination and the strength of small-town America. And his work continues to inspire readers and dreamers around the world. So he inspires people to believe that no dream is too big. So he's going to share his journey in this episode from the coalfields to the cosmos and everything in between, and reminding us that innovation and inspiration often begins in places just like Appalachia. I want to thank Burke Allen of Allen Media Strategies for facilitating this visit and interview, and to UVA-wise Media Services for recording it. This episode begins with Homer telling the true story of the time his parents returned a pet alligator to Florida, which became the subject of one of his books, Bringing Albert Home. I hope you enjoy.
If they're reading one of my books, typically, I don't care where they are, they get hold of me. They say, "Will you come to our book club?" And it's like, no, you're in Seattle. I probably can't make it, but I will Zoom with you. And I love to Zoom with these. They're about 95% women, generally. They've usually had several glasses of wine by the time they bring me on, and it is just the best fun. And of course, they're talking about something that I love, a book that I wrote. It did shape my ability to write. I knew early on that I wanted to be a writer. If it hadn't been for Sputnik, I'd probably ended up being an English professor at some Midwest college because I was much more oriented toward reading and writing. But that Sputnik caused me to sounded like an adventure, and I wanted to be part of that. So yeah, I twisted my mind so I could actually learn calculus and go get through engineering school. But ultimately, I always wanted to write. I had a little newspaper in Coalwood. It was called the Coalwood News, and we printed the salacious gossip. I was in like the second grade when I was doing that. Until I wrote this story, it was actually the best story that I ever wrote about this woman who chased a snake in the creek, fell down in the creek, got all wet, and claimed a crawdad had bit her. It was a great story. Everybody laughed, but the problem was that woman was my mom. So she took away my First Amendment rights for many, many years. But I did write for the college newspaper at Virginia Tech. I had my own column there. And then a number of years passed before I got very interested in telling the story of the U.S. Coast Guard during World War II. And that was my first book, a book called Torpedo Junction that I worked on for 20 plus years. But yeah, so I was one of those lucky people to have kind of dual careers as an engineer and as a published author. But I can tell you, even as an engineer, I had a lot better engineers come to me that were not able to write down or articulate their project. They just didn't have that capability. And so they would ask me to help them write it. So I got my name on their work. It was great. It helped my career by being able to be a good writer. So no matter what career you end up in, if you're able to be a good writer, put things together and present them in a cogent form, then it's going to really help your career.
You write both nonfiction and fiction. So what's that like to go back from the technical aspects of some of the things you write about, and then you're able to also tell stories?
Yeah, so I like to read both nonfiction and fiction. I tend to write in the genres that I read a lot in. I like historical fiction. For instance, I read a lot of historical fiction, and I also just love history as well. So my first book, I really thought the first book that I wrote was going to be the book that I would be known for, and that's Torpedo Junction, which hardly anybody knows about now. But that, again, took 20 plus years of research, working off the Outer Banks of North Carolina, diving on the sunken U-boats out there, doing all that research, actually moving to Germany for 3 years so I could interview U-boat crews and all that. So I was really obsessed with telling the story of our Coast Guard fighting the Germans off the East Coast during World War II. So that's purely historical. However, that can be a pretty dry read, if you will. So I had read so much and thought to myself, how can I get an audience for what's essentially a story? It's a history, and a lot of people get bored with history. Okay, you're sinking ship after ship after ship, so what? And I latched on the idea of writing it almost as if it was fiction by focusing on one tiny little Coast Guard cutter. So we got to know all the crew members on this tiny little Coast Guard cutter trying to fight these U-boats off of North Carolina. So I'd keep coming back to them very in a fictional way, although it was all nonfiction. It was what I started to learn when I would go out before I wrote the book and talk to people about what all this research that I was doing. What I started to understand when it comes to both speaking and writing, what people are interested in is other people. The plot doesn't matter. The background doesn't matter as much as the people involved, the characters that you develop. So Torpedo Junction taught me a lot. It was a very successful book. I thought that was a book that I was meant to write, was not going to write another one. I wrote a very short piece for a magazine called Smithsonian Air and Space. And I was working for NASA at the time, and I was busy. I was over in Japan. I was over in Russia. I was doing a lot of things. So I really didn't think about writing anything of book length. But I wrote this short little piece. They asked me for 2,000 words on anything I wanted to write. And because I'd written a number of articles for them, and I looked across my desk, and there sat this perfectly crafted steel De La Salle rocket nozzle from when I was a boy in Coalwood, West Virginia, and I built rockets. And honestly, I had not thought about that for decades. And I thought to myself, and I was talking to the editor at the time, and I said, I could write you 2,000 words when I was a boy growing up in West Virginia, and I built rockets. And her name was Pat Trenner, and she was completely, totally, utterly underwhelmed with this idea. And didn't think it would be interesting. But as I wrote it, I started remembering things like how my dad was against us doing this, and my mom was supportive, and our teacher, all this stuff started coming back. When it came out, a couple of months later, my telephone almost melted down. I was getting calls not only from New York editors who knew me from Torpedo Junction, but Hollywood. And they were saying, we want to make a movie out of this. Are you going to write a book about it? And I said, well, I guess I am now. And so that's how I ended up writing the memoir Rocket Boys I'm best known for. And that one, again, uses the techniques of fiction. With a memoir, you're able to have composite characters, you're able to move your time frames around, and it doesn't follow the precision that you have to do with, say, an autobiography or a history. So that's the nice thing about memoirs. But I did want to get into fiction. I know the New York, I was working with Doubleday, and they would have preferred that I just continue to write Rocket Boys over and over again in any way that I could. And I just wanted to get away from that and write some real fiction. All the characters are fiction. When I had researched Torpedo Junction and worked along the Outer Banks, I had so many stories that people would tell me about, oh yeah, the German U-boat crews, they would come ashore and they go to the theater, and we'd see them over there, and they'd try to pay us in Deutschmarks and all this kind of crazy stuff that I knew wasn't true, but were really great stories. And so I thought, and of course I got to know the lighthouse keepers and all that kind of thing. So that was my Back to the Moon was actually the first fiction book that I wrote and had published, but I had written that before Rocket Boys. It was one of those cases where Rocket Boys was so successful, they came to me and said, do you have anything else we can publish right away? And I said, I got something in my desk drawer here. And it turned out to be Back to the Moon, which I had just been kind of dabbling with over the years. But Keeper's Son was my really true first, totally, utterly fictional novel. And it turned out into a trilogy. Keeper's Son, The Ambassador's Son, and The Far Reaches, the Josh Thurlow series. I really, really enjoyed working that. I get dragged back into nonfiction occasionally, which is fine. My latest is a book that's really a true sequel to Rocket Boys. It's the next 40 years after the Rocket Boys. It includes my time at Virginia Tech, Vietnam, diving the U-boats, and then learning how to write, and then NASA, and then my publishing career up to the point where Rocket Boys was published. My whole life changed after that. So I'm trying to do both. And I also have my own imprint now. I am a publisher. So I would really love to get some Appalachian writers under my imprint. My imprint's with Headline Books. It's a major independent publisher, and I'm just at the point in my career and life right now. I think I'd like to nurture and bring on writers as much as I can.
That's exciting. You would never run out of ideas of things to write about, as many experiences as you've had.
What was your most memorable project while working at NASA?
My most memorable project, well, I had several, and I write a little bit about this in Don't Blow Yourself Up, so I can talk about writing at the same time. With NASA, the only rocket that I worked on in NASA was when Challenger went down. I knew that was in 1986, and long before any of you were born, but that was a big deal for NASA where we lost the shuttle and we lost a crew. And so I did volunteer. I was actually over in Japan at the time, training the first Japanese astronauts. Most of my career was spent either underwater at NASA. I worked in the suits underwater in a big tank called Neutral Buoyancy Simulator, and then also trained astronauts to work on Space Lab or space stations. I was in Japan training the Japanese, and I was brought back to work on the solid rocket motors. The first time I'd worked on a solid rocket motor since Coalwood in 1960. But I immediately was smart enough to recognize it was a really awful design. And so we redesigned those motors. But I would say the Hubble Space Telescope, probably. Again, way before you were born. You know about the Hubble Space Telescope, right? That's the most famous space observatory up there. It has changed the way that we think about ourselves. We used to think that there was only one galaxy and we were in it. And now we look, and all those other were just stars out there. It turns out all those stars were galaxies themselves. And the Hubble showed us all that. But when the Hubble went up, it was nearsighted. It couldn't see. Everything was a blur. They had ground the mirror wrong. And I didn't have anything to do with that, by the way. But I did have something to do with the repair. We had to go fix it. And so that was a big event. Again, I write about this in Don't Blow Yourself Up. But NASA, in its wisdom, decided to appoint an astronaut by the name of Story Musgrave to lead the team that would go up and fix the Hubble. And so Story, people were interested in other people. Writing about Story was extremely interesting. Story has a medical, and he's an MD, he has about 4 or 5 PhDs. He's been married 7 or 8 times. He was dating Dorothy Hamill at the time, who is a figure skater, a famous figure skater. She did the Hamill Camel in the Olympics. And Dorothy had told Story that the way she did her performances was when she practiced, she always went end to end. And that meant when she started, she went all the way to the end. She didn't do partials. She was doing the body language so her body would remember every move. And Story decided he was going to fix the Hubble the same way. He was going to come and train end to end, which meant he needed to be underwater at 40 feet for over 6 hours, which meant he would be into decompression sickness. I won't get into that. But anyway, you can't stay underwater for all that time, and you get the bends. You've probably heard of the bends. How could we get Story underwater for that long without getting the bends? And we came up with something called nitrox, which is a higher content oxygen in air. And it's like, okay, great, we can do this. We can pump nitrox down. There's one problem. He might catch on fire. And they go, okay, any volunteers, Homer? Get in the suit. So it was an interesting story. I got to go in, and I didn't catch on fire, which was kind of cool. And then Story, and they went up and fixed the Hubble. And then I trained the first Japanese astronauts, and that was interesting, needless to say. And then I went over to Russia and negotiated with them on the International Space Station, which was interesting too. Again, I ended up writing about all that in the latest. Good question. But as a writer, honestly, start paying attention now to people and the way they talk. And you may not use dialogue just exactly, but the way that people communicate, and start thinking about if you find somebody who's interesting, talk to them. And like I did Quentin years ago, Quentin, the prototypical nerd of all time. Nobody liked to talk to him. I talked to Quentin. I found him really, really interesting. And he became probably the more interesting rocket boys of the ones that I wrote about. Just remember, when you write your stories, that's what people are really interested in, other people.
Don't get me wrong, I love the convenience that technology offers, but I'm so glad I grew up in a world without AI. My childhood was filled with truth and hardworking, creative people. I didn't have to wonder if the creativity I saw was real. It was right in front of me in Mama's soup, beans, and cornbread, in the green of a lettuce bed, in the branches of trees my mom painted in her landscapes, in the harmony of the Good Shepherd Quartet, in the wormy chestnut bookshelves and boxes my poppy made, in the stitches of crocheted blankets, in the black and white photos my Mama colorized by hand, in the bejeweled colors of canned vegetables held to sunlight. I spent time on porches, in tobacco fields, on a hard church pew, at the ocean, in the woods, at the river, in caves, at a molasses pan, and all without looking through a screen. Yes, life gets more convenient with every generation. Mine was certainly easier than my parents and grandparents. But mine was the last generation to know life before an entire world was created in pixels that would render us unable or unwilling to know the difference between what is real and what is fake. If you want more content like bonus episodes, writing, behind-the-scenes photos, and storytelling that you can trust has been researched and written by me, not AI, head over to the Talkin' Appalachian Patreon page. You can connect with me there as well and share your own personal voice play story. Join for free and decide if you want to upgrade your subscription later. Talkin' Appalachian on Patreon.
Who is the most fascinating and influential person that you've met in all of the things you've experienced?
Oh, my mother. My mother was the person, the preacher would say, when God closes a door, if you wait, he'll open another. And my mom said, Sonny, just knock a window out and crawl through it if that happens. That's just the way. She was quite the woman who kept me squared away, and whatever I was interested in, she was going to get interested in too, and make sure that I had all the tools I need to accomplish it throughout life. And again, she's a very interesting character. My brother and I famously, I wrote about in Rocket Boys, never got along as kids. We were very competitive for a variety of different reasons. And so years later, people would ask me, so, Mr. Hickam, have you and your brother, are you okay together? And I go, oh, yeah, we're best buddies now because we have a common enemy, our mother. You know, she always caused us to want to succeed and that she would be happy with what we were doing. So definitely my mom, besides people, my mom, my dad, of course, and the people of Coalwood, all the people of Coalwood that I grew up with were very interested in their kids and seeing that we succeeded in life. So I think I've gone through my whole life with the idea that I'm being watched by the people of Coalwood and the great teachers that I was lucky enough to have growing up.
So they made a movie about it. Were you happy with how the movie ended up?
Well, it's a movie, right? Yes, it's probably every author's hope and dream that a movie will be made out of a book that you wrote because it's like a constant commercial. October Sky, which is an anagram of Rocket Boys. You know what an anagram is? Where you move the letters around. That's how they came up with the title. October Sky right now is on Netflix. It's all over the place. And every time somebody sees it, at the end it says based on the memoir Rocket Boys, and somebody, a ka-ching, I can almost hear it, you know. People are buying my book. So it's great. And the movie doesn't track the book, but it just can't possibly. It's a different art form. I was somewhat involved with the writing of the screenplay. The screenplay was written by a fellow by the name of Louis Kolick, who was from New York City. Had never been to West Virginia, had no wish to ever go to West Virginia. Wasn't exactly sure there was a West Virginia. So I had a lot of interesting conversations with Louis as he wrote the book, and he was reluctant to write it at first. He was known as an A-list writer. An A-list writer is a writer who will write a screenplay that will almost surely become a movie. I mean, even though they write the screenplay, even though they put up money, even though they option your book, it doesn't mean necessarily they're going to make the movie. So we really wanted Louis to write this screenplay. And he was reluctant because he thought, well, it's West Virginia. I don't know anything about it. But I started talking to him about what life was growing up in Brooklyn. He grew up in Brooklyn. And there wasn't that big. Yes, there was a lot more buildings around, but that was about it. You go out in the street and you'd play and you had your parents and you did things that they didn't like, and everybody talked up and down, all the gossip, and so just like Coalwood. I said, Brooklyn's just like Coalwood, just a little bit bigger, that's all. And so I was able to sell him to write the screenplay. He introduced a few things that I didn't like, but I was invited on set. I was on set about 3/4 of the time as they filmed it. They filmed it close to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was about a 3-hour drive from where I lived in Huntsville, Alabama. So I was up there quite a bit. And got to know Chuck Gordon, the producer, and Joe Johnson, the director, and the actors. Jake Gyllenhaal, by the way, I apologize to you young ladies for not actually being Jake Gyllenhaal. But I hear he apologizes for not being me. So anyway, not really. But Jake was a wonderful young man. He was 16 years old when they made the movie. He had to break every so often to go I think he was taking Latin and calculus while I was there. And the other boys in that movie, most of them were in their early 20s, but they looked, like teenagers. But Jake being so young, he had to have a parent with him all the time. So his mom was with him all the time. And after he had a hard day of shooting, they would go back to their hotel room. He'd go back to his hotel room with his mom, while the other boys would go to Walmart and hang out with these Tennessee girls and have a good time, So if he looked stressed in that movie, he actually was pretty stressed about the whole thing. But so I got to know the actors and so on. So you start forgiving everything. And it's like, okay, Jake would come to me and even it was in the script that I quit school and went to work in the coal mines. And, well, there were child labor laws even in West Virginia. But okay, all right. So Jake would come to me and says, well, what was it like, Mr. Hickam, to quit school and go work in the coal mines? And of course, that did not happen. I have to kind of revert to the third person. Well, it would have been awful. Didn't want to exactly lie to him. Because I did end up working in the coal mines when I went to Virginia Tech. I would come home every summer and work in the coal mines. So I did have a reference to it and tried to to transmit to Jake. But, he's a good actor. It was a good screenplay. Ultimately, I'm really, really happy with the movie. I still get letters from all around the world. I'll thank you for that movie. It has really inspired me to do whatever. It's not just engineering, but just succeed in life. And a movie has an impact that even a book can't have, because it's so visceral and you're absorbing all of that. And of course, it makes everybody cry at the end when the father puts his arm around the boy, and I cry because that didn't really happen. What happened was I put my arm around my father. When they filmed that scene, I went up to Joe Johnston, the director, and I said, Joe, that's not how it happened in the book. What happened was my dad was having trouble breathing. He was so excited, I thought he was going to collapse. So I went over and put my arm around him to hold him up. And I said, and of course, he had arranged all day long to get everybody in place, and they had filmed this wonderful scene. It was all good. And I'm saying, why don't we do it over my way? And then Joe went, Homer, we're just trying to sell popcorn here. You understand that, right? And if we don't have this payoff where the father hugs the boy, no, we'll just do it my way. And he was right. He was totally, utterly right. And it is a different art form, movies. I've written a couple of screenplays since then, still trying to get them made. But I can definitely tell you it's a different art form. And you just have to understand it. You've got 90 minutes to tell a story. With a book, I've got 400, 500 pages, whatever I want. And I can have a lot more characters and a lot more situations. But movies have to be pretty succinct in that way.
Well, I want to be a historian, specifically about the Cold War.
Okay. Well, you should interview me. I'm a Cold Warrior from way back, right? Sputnik and then Vietnam. And Rocket Boys tells that story to a great extent. And during the summers, I'm on the board at Space Camp. And so Landon can tell you all about that. Been to Space Camp a couple of times down in Huntsville, Alabama. But so we have teachers that come down on scholarship to Space Camp. And that's my part. I go talk to them about Sputnik and what that was like back in the late 1950s. We were in the Cold War. The Russians had nuclear weapons. They had them on bombers circling all the time. We had them on bombers circling all the time. And then they launched Sputnik, and it just scared everybody to death. So except for us kids who were reading a lot of science fiction, we thought it was really cool. And that's why I ended up building rockets, because I thought it was really cool. But a lot of people think that and actually I guess I am old enough to have worked on Apollo, the missions to the moon, but I was in Vietnam during that time. So that's the dichotomy of the Cold War era, is that we had these great advancements in technology that ultimately led to everything that we've got today with computers and space flight, and just all of our technology really came out of the Cold War. But we also had these little wars like Vietnam that were all part of that as well. So it was an interesting time to grow up.
I have a two-part question, which goes with writing and engineering. I read that you got up, is this right? You got up at 4:30 in the morning to write because you were still working for NASA,
Right.
so that was your writing time.
Yeah.
So we know it takes discipline. And you said you have to be an observer of people and listen to people. And so I guess what else would you tell an aspiring writer, especially somebody from Appalachia that wants to write, maybe about Appalachia, maybe not, but wants to get it right? And then my second part to that question is, what about aspiring engineers, people who want to follow in your footsteps, but maybe writers can get intimidated by writing. People who want to go into engineering can get intimidated by the math and science part of that.
Writing's harder, frankly. Well, I can give you an example. Right, again, I have my own imprint now, so I'm looking for good writers. And I've found a couple of good writers who are really good writers, but they haven't latched on to the right story yet. So, and that's difficult sometimes. I was very fortunate to have this experience growing up in Coalwood and building the rockets that for some reason touched people's hearts. And by then, having written Torpedo Junction and written a lot of freelance work, writing work, I then had the tools to write this best-selling work. So some of it's luck, but some of it's skill, some of it's talent. It takes skill, talent, and luck to be a famous writer, but you can still make a living at it, even if you're not if you don't get a movie made out of your book and that kind of thing. So it really is hard work. In order to be a good writer, however, you really do have to be a good reader. And the reason I asked you about genres is that authors tend to fall into different genres. They will write adventure, they'll write history, they'll write thrillers, they'll write romance novels. And in order to really be good in those genres, you have got to read a lot. As for engineering, so engineering's first you have to get the academics done. I mean, that's absolutely it. I mean, you can be a writer and never go to school to learn how to be a writer. You don't have to do that. It helps. It honestly helps to be able to talk to writers like me and have classes in it and being graded on it and dissected, and so that helps. It really does help, but it's not necessary. With engineering, unfortunately, you do. You got to go to school and you got to absorb all of that math, and you got to absorb all of that the techniques of being an engineer. So again, Virginia Tech was a tough school for me. It really was. I flunked statics 3 times. I'm willing to confess that because now I'm their most famous alumni. So I'm willing to go look at my grade transcript. That's great. But that's a good story, and I tell it in Don't Blow Yourself Up. So statics is in the second year of engineering school. You take statics and dynamics. And dynamics is the hard one, but statics is the one that kills you because it's the first one you run into. And it was taught by a professor who was head of the engineering mechanics department. And his name was Dr. Dan Plata. And we called him Dirty Dan. If you were really lucky, you got out with a C the first time you took statics from Dirty Dan, but most people got D's, and over half the class would flunk. It was just almost automatic, and that's the way it was back in Virginia Tech at that time. I took it from Dan and flunked the first time, and what you did, everybody said, okay, so now you did the Dan thing, go to a graduate student, you'll get an A from the grad student, and I was just so stubborn. I'm going to take it from Dan Plata the second time. I'm going to get my D out of Dan Plata. He flunked me the second time. All right, go to the grad. Nope, I'm taking it from Dr. Plata. I got my C the third time, and then I got an A in dynamics, which is a lot harder after that. So years later, who should I find in my signing line but Dirty Dan Plata's daughter? And she came up to me and she said, Mr. Hickam, you were a legend in my house with my dad. He could not believe that he had somebody take his class 3 times. And so it turned out to be a good story. I'm glad that I did that. And believe me, I know statics. After that, I do know statics, which is, by the way, it's a study of suspension bridges, things that don't move, static things, all the forces that go through it. It's complicated. I deserve to flunk it many times, but you'll do great, Landon. All right. So anyway, you got to go through. So once you go through engineering school, I have to tell you, it almost doesn't matter in a lot of ways. I mean, I was about the only Virginia Tech graduate at Marshall Space Flight Center where I went to work most of my NASA years. And I worked with MIT, Georgia Tech, Caltech, engineering graduates, and we all knew about the same stuff. So engineering is a profession where there's a lot of camaraderie amongst engineers. We all have somehow survived engineering school. And now we are an engineer, even though sometimes we don't know how to spell it. Like I said, I wrote for the college paper. So I was kind of oriented in that direction, but I did not know how to make a profession of writing, honestly. So, however, I was in a good situation. When I came back from Vietnam is when I realized I'm kind of missing something in my life, and it was writing. So I wanted to be a writer, but my degree was engineering. So naturally, that's the way I made money. So and I liked it. I liked my work. I worked for the Army Missile Command and then later for NASA, and I liked that work. It was good work. Really enjoyed it, but I did want to write. So the question was, what was I going to write about? Again, I was lucky. After the 60s, the 70s and 80s and on into the 90s were like really great time for freelance writers. So we had all of these different magazines. They're still out there, but they don't use freelance writers very much anymore. But we had writers or magazines on cars and popular mechanics and popular science and RVs and all these specialty magazines were out there. And they needed a lot of articles. And so it was like freelance heaven. And I became a scuba instructor in 1973, which was all kind of brand new back then, and started looking at the different magazines. There was Skin Diver magazine, Sport Diver magazine, Diving USA. There was a bunch of scuba magazines, and I would read the articles, and I thought I could do that well. So that's how I cut my teeth writing. Is I started. It was back then you would write a query letter, and put it in with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and you would mail it off to this editor that didn't know you, never heard of you, and somehow you needed to grab them with that query letter about what you wanted to write about, and then you'd wait and look at your mailbox, 2 or 3 times a day, still no answer, and then finally something would come back, usually a rejection, but very often it would come back and say, well, we're interested in your story, so here's how many words we want, and they get a little advice, and then you sit behind your typewriter or your computer and you start writing this article. And that's the way I learned to write. Writing at first about the techniques of scuba diving. Then later, as I got into it, I started diving on these shipwrecks. And I thought, well, okay, I started researching the shipwrecks, the history of the shipwreck or the ship why it wrecked, and so what it was and what happened to the crew, and then diving on it and taking pictures underwater. So I was really able to have a kind of a side profession of writing by writing freelance articles. And that was really, really good for me. So I was really set up by the time that I happened upon diving on these German U-boats off of Cape Hatteras and starting research that whole battle that occurred there. I was in a really, really good position by being able to write that and then interesting a publisher, because I had a track record already. I could say, well, I've written for all these different magazines, and okay, so they would be willing to look at my manuscript. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist too much anymore. It's hard for me to offer you advice in the world of writing these days. How do you do it? Of course, you can go out, you can write your own blogs and so on, and try to attract some attention with your writing in that regard. I guess you could write long pieces for Facebook. I don't know. That would work. But you do need to kind of cut your teeth on writing. And there are still small presses that you can look for. It's kind of hard to swing for the bleachers right off the bat, but a lot of people do with the first book. But like I said, part of my success is the fact I was during a very, very lucky time. And when the Torpedo Junction was actually published by a publisher called Naval Institute Press, which you may never heard of, but it's well known around people who read a lot of naval history. And matter of fact, do any of you remember an author by the name of Tom Clancy? Does that ring a bell? I mean, it used to, I was able to say Tom Clancy, and everybody knew exactly who I was talking to. Now you don't. So Tom Clancy wrote a book called The Hunt for Red October, and then a number of thrillers after that. And he really started the international thriller, if you will, genre. He was the guy who did that. But his first publisher was also a small press, Naval Institute Press, just like me. As a matter of fact, as I was writing Torpedo Junction, Tom Clancy was writing me letters or calling me on the phone asking about submarines. He was writing about nuclear submarines, and I was writing about World War II diesel submarines. But nonetheless, it's kind of interesting that as soon as he wrote Hunt for Red October, President Reagan was seen walking out of the White House carrying the book, The Hunt for Red October, and then he sold about 1 million copies after that. But I have 2 social media presences. I don't do TikTok or any of that. I'm sorry. I'm 82 years old. Can't really do that kind of stuff. But I do have Facebook. That's where most of us hang out. The boomers hang out. I happen to know Elon, so I do X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it. And what do I put up on those? I never put up anything political or controversial or anything. I'll put up that I came here probably, and we'll have pictures of us around campus and so on. I'll put that up, and I won't even say anything about my writing, just that I came to visit UVA-wise and met the students, and we talked about writing and so on. But no matter what I put, go out to my Facebook and go out to my X and see what I'm putting up. No matter what I put up, if you peel back the onion of what I'm putting up, it says, buy my book. Over time, you sell a book a day. It kind of adds up, and hopefully you'll do more than that. And Christmas sales are really important. By the way, I have written I've written several screenplays, but two actually might be made into films. I wrote a book called The Coalwood Way, which was actually it's not a sequel. I call it the equal to Rocket Boys. When I was writing Rocket Boys, I started writing the story that happened the last Christmas I was in Coalwood, 1959, where there's a big snowstorm and a lot of things happen about that or working around that. And my mom's pet squirrel, Chipper, got loose, and because Roy Lee opened the window. But anyway, so I was writing all this with Rocket Boys, and I realized it was really going off into a tangent here. So the great thing about computers these days is that I cut that out of the story, but I had it still on the computer. So after Rocket Boys was such a big success, they wanted a sequel right off the bat, and I said, I don't want to write you a sequel, but I want to write you an equal. It happens right in the middle of the Rocket Boys story at Christmas time. So it's kind of the Rocket Boys Does Christmas. That was a New York Times bestseller as well, called The Coalwood Way. Now, years later, I've decided to turn that into a screenplay. I'm going to call it December Sky. But we have the potential of getting that made, hopefully in the next year or so.
I had a dialect question, but then you said Elon, that you were friends with Elon. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. You wrote that when the movie was being made, they needed to train the boys on how to speak like you spoke in West Virginia. Right. And I wonder what that was like. You recommended a friend of yours who was a professor, right, to be a dialect coach?
Yeah. Emily Sue Buckberry. She was a professor at Ohio University, speech therapy. And so Natalie Canada played my mom's from Arkansas, so she's got an Arkansas accent throughout the movie. Chris Cooper's from Missouri, so he has kind of a Missouri accent. But they wanted the boys to have an authentic McDowell County, West Virginia accent. And I don't know they came to me and I go, I really don't know what that is, frankly. Our accent, I don't have the heavy drawl that somebody like Chuck Yeager has. I don't.
He was from West Virginia.
Yeah, and about 40 miles from Coalwood. But the coal fields, our accent got flattened down a little bit because we had people after World War II from Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, the eastern part of Russia. A lot of refugees came into the coal fields at that time. The Italians came in, and a lot of Pennsylvanians came in. And also, the black people were coming up from Mississippi. So you had that mixture of dialects all around us kids. And we were, and it was also when television was starting to become popular. So that tends to flatten the dialect too, because that's all Midwestern stuff. People on television tend to speak, I think, like a Midwestern, Kansas, not Oklahoma, not that far south, but Kansas, Indiana, something like that. Kind of a really flat accent. And so I really couldn't tell the producers what to do. So they asked Emily Sue Buckberry to come, and she, as being a speech therapy professor, recognized that there is a particular little bit of a dialect for the coal fields that we did not necessarily. For one thing, our teachers trained us out of. We didn't say chimney. We said chimney. They would correct us if we used the wrong word, or if we didn't. Even though the kids coming out of the holler there would say holler and not hollow, would say far instead of fire. But our teachers would get on us about that. So you're going out into the world, and when you do, you need to speak correctly because people will judge you on your dialect. And it's true. They do.
Well, and some people won't know what a far is
Exactly.
when you mean a fire.
Yeah, and you mean fire. So it was that kind of thing. And so Emily Sue did a real good job, and she did. The one word I didn't agree with, when they asked the kid, Homer, in the movie, what he wants to know about rockets, his answer is, if you'll notice, and it kind of grates on my ear every time he says this, it's everything. Emily Sue taught him to say everything because she said that's what we did in McDowell County. I never said everything. I'm sorry. It's everything. But that's the kind of thing that happened. So yeah, she really enjoyed her day with those four boys. teaching them West Virginia dialects.
So when you first started getting into engineering, you said that you had to twist your mind to be able to learn the math required. And I'm the same way. I'm much more of an English guy than a math guy. But what was that process like to be able to train your mind?
Well, Landon, I had a good reason to do it, right? So I was building the rockets, and in order to build the rockets that Miss Riley wanted us to build that would be successful in the science fairs, we needed to know how they worked, not just trial and error and make them work, which is fun. Don't blow yourself up. That's where that comes from. But we needed to learn the math behind them in order to create these perfectly crafted De Laval rocket nozzles. So in order to do that, you have to know calculus. And then you did it all by hand, really. So what was it like? It wasn't hard. When I realized that I needed to know it, it wasn't hard. When I thought, well, I don't really need to know this, it was more difficult than I should have made it. But when I had a reason, and of course, when you go to college and engineering school, you have a reason, you've got to learn it. And you just do it. You just sit down and study it. And you maybe have to study a little bit longer than somebody who's really mathematically inclined, but it'll come. It will. And especially as you go, the first 2 years in engineering school are the hardest. The last 2 years are the easiest because by then you got the basics and you're actually learning something that you're going to use later on. It's rare that an engineer these days would ever sit down and do calculus by hand. The computer will already spit that answer out for you. Then you take that answer and do something with it. But you do have to get those basics to it. So, it was a little bit hard. Like I said, statics was the only engineering course I really had problems with. That was because of Dr. Pletta. But there were some engineering students that were that's all they ever wanted to do. They were the type that took the clock apart at home and put it back together. I was never like that. It's like, Mom, my clock's broken, buy me a new one. That's where I was. So yeah, you'll do fine. Just because you're worrying over it, I know you're going to do fine. Mainly you want to do something that you wake up every morning and go, oh boy, I get to go do that, whatever it is. And for years I would wake up and say, oh boy, I get to go work for NASA.